We've been taking a look at the Northern Renaissance, and I showed you two major works that are symbolic of the movement, a much larger movement. So you can use these as kind of microcosms, and then as you study other early Northern Renaissance art, you'll know where they're coming from and what the common style is, and the major works of art that start to influence other artists. And so you can kind of see the influence of Jan van Eyck and Grunewald and other works. I wanted this lecture to mainly focus on the social and the historical context of what's also happening in the North, and how this is going to shape art in the North. And so we've already seen some ideas start moving towards the North. I want to take a look at how the North is responding to this, and examine how we're going to see some further changes in art between these two areas, right? The first one is with the cultural exchange, right? The first part of this is moving ideas out of Italy to the North. And the first major wave of this happens with the Italian Wars of 1496 to 1527. So France comes in and claims Naples in 1494, and this is right about when Savonarola is starting to pick up steam and starting to suggest that, France, these foreign invaders are coming in to take over, and this is an indication that the judgment of God is upon Florence, right? So this is kind of the beginning, the catalyst of creating those fears, and this is also going to be the catalyst that begins to break up the relative peace and harmony that Italy has experienced for the last 100 years, right? So this is kind of the beginning of that transition towards the late Renaissance and early Mannerism, right? Kind of styles that start emerging. It really doesn't formalize until 1520 with the death of Raphael, or 1527 with the sack of Rome. But this is kind of the beginning, the origins of foreign nations coming in and making a claim. Francis I was the major individual that came in at first. And he shatters what is known as the Peace of Lodi, which was established in 1454, where it said that city-states such as Naples, Florence, and Venice would not invade each other. So this is helping to create that peace. And so mainly what Florence was interested in, because they were led by the signores, they were led by the ruling merchant class, they wanted peace rather than war, and so that's what they were negotiating. So Italy comes together and says, you know what, war is really costly, and it doesn't really accomplish anything. And so these three kind of nation states that were separate cities that function as separate governments, they came together and they formed what is known as the Peace of Lodi. But when France invades in 1494, kind of all bets are off. We're like, I don't want to get involved, right? So it begins with Francis I, who's the king of France at the time. He laid a hereditary claim to Naples, and then agreed to help Milan in a controversy between Naples and Florence and the papacy. And so he's starting to integrate into Italian politics, right? And that starts to kind of break up those alliances. The Pope, with the help of Spain, later removed France from Italy, but in 1499, France returns and makes a claim, this time to Milan. All right, so the idea they keep coming back and breaking up that kind of stability, right? Full-scale fighting took place in 1522 when Francis I and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who we've talked about a little bit before, fought over the future of Italy. So now we have these foreign invaders coming in, and now they're fighting over dividing up Italy, right? And that's going to create even further problems. France eventually wins, and for the next several years, Italian leaders were mere puppets to foreign hands, right? So this is kind of breaking up the Renaissance and the idea of stability, the idea of economic prosperity, then being able to fund the artists, right? So the idea is that there's these foreign invaders in France with Francis I, and Charles V, who's mainly in Germany, coming in to kind of ransack Italy, kind of tear it apart. But then the art and the ideas, they're going to bring back the ideas of Donatello. They're going to bring back the ideas of Leonardo. They're going to bring back the ideas of Michelangelo, and they're going to bring back actual works of theirs, and they're going to show the local people, and they're going to say, these are amazing, let's see if we can replicate that. And so that's the idea of the cultural exchange, is that we have the ideas starting to move, even though it's through military means, at least at this point, there is a transmission of ideas between them. This one's kind of an interesting one. This one is the Cour du Cheval Blanc, or what is known as the White Horse Yard. As Francis I was invading Italy, he became fascinated with the Italian Renaissance and brought these ideas of art back to the north with him. And so, again, we're starting to see the exchange of ideas that we see here with his chateau. He, in fact, he loved Leonardo, and he hired Leonardo to be an artist for him. And so Leonardo goes to France and spends the rest of his life there. And so, again, this kind of cultural exchange. And so they're not only bringing art back, but they're also bringing artists back. And these ideas are going to start spreading northward. Here we see the emphasis on a court palace, right? So this kind of building, which is different from what we've seen in the past. Rather than having a palace be a castle or a fortification, something to arm oneself as a means of protection against the enemy. Here we see the chateau is not built for fortification. That the ideas that are starting to change is that maybe buildings should be more about pleasure, more about being ornate, and enjoying life rather than war, right? So he liked, Francis I liked Italian architecture designs, and he brings these back with this image here, right? Notice this is not about columns or domes, but it's about simplicity, though, right? So it doesn't have the domes and columns that we would see in Italy, but it does have the simplicity. It does have the elegance, right? Here there are more than 1,500 rooms, and holds up to about 2,000 people. And so in some ways, it was just kind of like a hotel for a royal family, right? It is considered to be one of the greatest masterpieces of Northern Renaissance architecture, right? And so just an example, one example of many of this kind of moving back and to these ideas. And here we see with the Louvre, so this is currently an art museum, but it didn't used to be. This used to be a palace. And so again, this shows more of the ideas of, this was also done during the Renaissance, at least it was started and added on. But it shows the idea of elegance. It shows the idea of, rather than fortification, we want something to be beautiful, right? So as we see on the far right-hand side, this is what a castle would have looked like earlier, but we start to see more of that balance, that simplicity, that beauty that we see in the Renaissance coming northward. Thinking about Charles V, he is a Habsburg that mainly comes from Germany-ish, right? But then he starts to gather lands from all over the world, right? So he has a hereditary claim to most of Europe. Most of the royal families were intermarried. They would marry, cousins and things like that to keep that royal blood within them. And so the gene pool becomes extremely narrow, and in fact, because it's so narrow, there's a history of hemophilia within a lot of the royal families in Europe. Families married their children mainly for political alliance, and so most of the royal families were somehow related to one another, and this is the environment that Charles V comes to power, right? Through marriages, he had family connections to most of Europe, and when he came to power, he started to consolidate an empire, trying to recreate that Roman Empire of old, right? So that's always been the standard, to try to reunite Europe. He began his career in 1515, claiming rule over the Netherlands, and so here on the map, the Netherlands over here, claiming rule to the Netherlands, and he becomes the Duke of Burgundy, right? So the Burgundy is kind of this region in the Netherlands and kind of northern Belgium area. We've talked about northern Belgium before when we were taking a look at Jan de Eyck. After the death of his paternal grandfather, Maximilian I, Charles was elected to be King of Germany in 1520. So again, he kind of comes back and he kind of rules this area as well. And in 1521, after the death of his maternal grandfather, Ferdinand II, Charles was proclaimed King of Aragon, which is kind of in France, and Castile. So he starts to own much of Europe and wanted to be crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. And this culmination of that kind of 1,000 years to reunite Europe. Charles came with the renewal, right? So the idea is that he's trying to go back to Rome, right? To kind of connect this, to renew this excitement, right? So again, the ideas of the Renaissance excitement, he begins to kind of think about, hey, we're going back to ancient Greek and Roman ideas. Let's kind of recreate Rome. And so he kind of sees this as his own kind of political renaissance, so to speak. However, to be Holy Roman Emperor, he needed the blessing and authority of the papacy. So he needs the Pope to say, yeah, I grant you the authority to rule all of Europe. Well, guess what? The Pope doesn't want to do that because the Pope is a little bit nervous about the amount of power that one person can have. And so he's like, not so much. And so this is only going to be the backdrop for when Martin Luther starts questioning the Pope's authority. He's going to remember that, and he's going to be pretty upset, right? But as we take a look at this, right, the Pope, angry with Germany because of the Reformation, doesn't want to do that. And so that there's that kind of rift that's happening between them. And so what happens is he sends his military down to Italy to try to force the hand. But because they're not being paid, the mercenaries weren't getting paid, they become angry and they sack Rome in 1527, right? And Clement the Seventh was ready to compromise, and they met in Bologna, which is a town in Italy, to crown him Holy Roman Emperor. So he kind of starts to get what he wants, but this proved to be more of a hollow kind of gesture than something that actually had some type of importance to it. By this time, Catholicism was already kind of reeling from the Protestant movement in the north, and so it seemed to be more of an empty proposal than anything, right? So it didn't really matter. He later abdicated his throne to his two sons, Ferdinand I and Philip II, and so again Europe starts to divide, right? But his that kind of 1,000-year kind of a desire to reunite and revive Europe under one rule in Rome failed, but it shows this kind of desire, right? But it also shows this connection that these ideas, as he starts to take over parts of Spain, parts of France, parts of Italy, the cultural exchange that's happening between them. Another major idea that's happening in the north that's a little bit different than what's happening in Italy is the idea of mysticism. Mysticism was the belief that in personal communication, anyone can communicate with God. You don't necessarily need a priest. You don't necessarily need a cardinal or a pope to do that for you, that we can have this individual communication with God, right? It cut out the need for Mary, the saints, on a person's behalf. It suggests that there's this direct communication. And that's really going to lead to the Reformation, this idea that if we don't need a priest, we don't need a monk to do that for us, why do we have one? And so people start suggesting that all they need is individual communication. So this idea of mysticism just suggests that you can have individual spiritual experiences for yourself. You don't need to be a saint to do that. And that plants the seed for people to start stepping back and stepping away from Catholicism, right? The other element that happens during this time is Northern humanism. So the Studia Humanitatis, which begins in Florence in the 15th century, starts moving northward, but and I mentioned this before in an earlier lecture. In the North, they see this differently, right? Humanism is mainly examining language and to get to the original translation, the original meaning, to liberate the mind from past biases or misunderstandings of the meaning. But where Italian humanists are mainly focusing on Arabic texts and Greek texts and Roman texts and just any kind of idea that's out there to find universal truths, mainly what the Northern humanists are focusing on is the New Testament, to focus on original meaning of the New Testament. And so this is where the ideas that are going to spread to Martin Luther as they're starting to look at original kind of context. One of the major Northern humanists during the time was Erasmus, and he wrote the Handbook of a Christian Knight. And he argues that teachings of Christ is all we need, right? We don't necessarily need all the other kind of clothing that the priests wear. We don't necessarily need, a priest. We don't really need anything. We just need the teachings of Christ, and that's it. And this is what he says. He says, maybe you go to Mass every day, but if you live your own life for your own selfish benefit and have no concern for the difficulties of your neighbor, as if they did not touch you at all, then all you have done is take part in this sacrament in a merely outward way. And so if you're just going there to take the sacrament, that's one thing. But if you're not really doing anything, it doesn't really do much for you, right? And so this, the idea here is that some in Catholicism would say, well, I'm going to Mass every day. What do you want from me, right? I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm checking all the boxes and this laundry list of things that I need to do during the day. I'm doing all of that. And what he's suggesting, what matters is where your heart is. If you're not really helping others, if you're just kind of taking care of yourself, then it doesn't really matter, right, what you do. It's just kind of hollow. And so Erasmus is kind of part of that idea that suggests, similar to mysticism, that all we need to do is our focus on a personal connection. Now, when Martin Luther comes about with the Protestants, Martin Luther is going to ask Erasmus to join the cause, and Erasmus is going to say, you know what, there's some problems within Catholicism, but I'm not really that comfortable with stepping that far away. And so he's like, I'm more about Reformation. I'm not about creating a new religion. And so they had this kind of connection initially, but then they kind of went their separate ways as Martin Luther started to kind of step more into the light and forming a religion. Mainly what we see with Martin Luther, the kind of Protestant Reformation in 1517, we've talked about that before, where he tacks the 95 Theses to the door in Wittenberg. Mainly, I just want to focus on a couple ideas. He argues that outward manifestations do not affect the soul, and so it doesn't necessarily matter if we're like Erasmus, if we're just doing a laundry list and check boxes off, it doesn't really affect us, right? Ceremonies and adornments cannot save human beings. We need to be able to have that intimate connection with God, right? So this is calling into question all of the kind of sacraments that the Catholic Church has, suggesting that those are all unnecessary because they're not really changing who we are. The people are just going through them, right? Kind of empty. He says the soul only nourished by the Word of God, not by all these things that the Catholic Church does, right? All the lists and all of the obligations, all of the duties, all of the customs. That doesn't really nourish the soul. And he says that faith is greater than works. What matters is our own individual faith and then what we do with that, right? So Germany will largely be Protestant, and that's going to be important in terms of art. There's going to be this separation, this divide between what's happening in the north in terms of how religion is affecting art and what's happening in Italy in terms of how the Counter-Reformation is affecting art. John Calvin devised his own religious ideas in Switzerland. He mainly argues that predestination, he argues that free will robs God's honor, that God knows everything, God controls everything, God is kind of this mastermind. And so if we think that humans have the ability to make our own choices, then it seems to lessen the importance and significance of the role of God in our lives. I think that's kind of the argument that he's making. I think as the members of the church, we kind of take issue with that. But he's taken issue with the idea of Mirandola, that we have this idea of agency. He suggests, man, God knows everything. Why are we fighting it, right? He says that humans are enslaved by sin and salvation comes only through God's mercy. And so that's what we should really focus on, is the mercy of God. And so what we're going to see with his ideas that's going to influence art, the focus on thrift, sobriety, industry, these are the noble virtues. And we'll take a look more at this with Baroque art. These ideas are going to become more and more profound as we take a look at the influence in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is going to be mainly Calvinist, and we're going to see how these ideas start to influence the Baroque artists in the Netherlands, right? These ideas will travel to France, the Netherlands, England, and even the New World, right? The pilgrims of the New World were Calvinists, right? They were Puritans. Puritans were Calvinists, and this creates this kind of religious tension. So France is going to have some struggles with religious wars. The Netherlands, to some extent. England definitely going to have some religious conflict in terms of if you are a Protestant or if you are an Anglican belonging to the Church of England. There's going to be some religious tensions over the next several hundred years that's going to create some major problems and major rifts. Henry VIII was also kind of part of this Reformation and the Anglican Church. He says the Scriptures contains all things necessary for salvation. So again, we don't need to do that laundry list that the Catholic Church tells us. We don't need a pope, we don't need saints, we don't need sacraments, we don't really need anything but our individual personal connection with God. Authority comes from Scripture, it comes through reason, it comes through tradition. So these are the three main things. If we want to accept truth and we want to know authority, if it says it in the Scriptures, if it makes sense, and if things have kind of been what we've been doing, then that's kind of it. Then it should be truth, and it should come from authority, right? Christians need baptism and they need communion, and that's pretty much it. So it's a limited kind of laundry list of things that we need to do. That Christian life involves regular praise and prayer. That's what we should be doing. Rather than focusing on all the sacraments, we should be focusing on praise and prayer and our communication with God, that individual aspect. And I want us to think about how these three individuals, right, John Calvin, Martin Luther, even Henry VIII, and the idea of mysticism and the ideas of Erasmus kind of infiltrate in the New World and become part of this kind of fertile soil for Joseph Smith when he comes around in the early 1800s, that all we need is our own personal connection with God, right? We can all have our own kind of religious experiences, and so that those ideas are right there around that area, and then in fact coming about with the restoration. So these ideas are part of the larger story of the restoration, right? So he doesn't necessarily, but just kind of getting back to Henry VIII, he doesn't necessarily see himself as separate from Catholics. He sees himself more as Reformed Catholics. And so Anglicans kind of see themselves as Reformed rather than as something else, something different from that, right? But mainly this starts, and you guys probably know the larger story. Henry VIII wanted a divorce, but the Catholic Church frowns upon divorce. And so he says, fine, I'm not going to follow you. I'm going to do my own religion. And so that's kind of where the origins of this Anglican Church stem from. And we just saw the passing on of the monarch from the Queen Elizabeth to now King Charles, and we saw that all happens within the religious context of the Anglican Church. That Charles needs to be Anglican. He needs to be a member of the Anglican Church, and then it all happens within Westminster. It all happens within the church where the coronation happens, and so it's all kind of mixed. The politics and religion are all mixed together, which sometimes becomes confusing for England, and that's why when the founding fathers were developing the United States, they said we need to have that separation. It's just too confusing. But what we're mainly going to see is there's two major areas, the Protestant areas and the Catholic areas. And these are going to influence and inspire artists in these areas. And so art's going to go in different directions, even though aesthetically there's going to be some similarities between how they represent ideas. The ideas are going to be very different, right? So the Protestant areas are going to be mainly in the north, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and England, all kind of part of that Protestant area. And then the Catholic areas are going to be Italy, Spain, and France. France is kind of an interesting anomaly. They kind of go back and forth between Protestants and Catholics. But for the most part, they're going to remain true to Catholicism. But notice, if you take a look at the map, they're all kind of connected. They all have this geographic kind of similarity. Similarly, in the north, we see that there's a geographic similarity between their borders, right? So that's all going to happen up here. And so you can see how the kind of the physical separation, the further away from Italy you go, the less influence Rome seems to have. And so that's going to be part of that transition as well. But I want us to mainly focus on how we see art differently, how they're representing art, how these ideas, Protestantism and Catholicism, influence art in these areas differently.